Mr. George, the country is at a crossroads. A new chapter with respect to the presidency is about to begin. A lot has been said. What are some of your thoughts on these issues?
Well, I think that we have to look at it from two aspects. I think we firstly have to look at it from a legal aspect, and of course, there's a moral and ethical aspect to the matter. And I have made it clear, very early, that when one looks at the Constitution, all right, and that's why I always like to be guided by the law. When one looks at the Constitution and you look at Section 24 of the Constitution, which deals with the issue of, choosing a president, Section 24 specifically makes mention of the possibility of a member of the House of Representatives or a member of the Senate being nominated to be elected as president. So what I'm saying is that if the framers of the Constitution clearly envisaged a scenario where you might have a sitting politician, a sitting member of the parliament, right, either in the House of Representatives or the Senate, being appointed as president, then clearly on this aspect, you are on solid legal ground if it is that the government decides they want to put Miss Christine Kangaloo as their choice for president, because clearly those who formulated our Constitution contemplated such a position, and they specifically mentioned it. So I think from the legal aspect, it's a non-issue that, yes, you can do it legally. But I also like to be guided, and the law also provides us guidance to show that, look, even though you may have something that is settled legally, you also need to always consider the full matrix in terms of the societal impact, and you must also take cognizance of the views of the citizens. And in fact, I can cite a 1936 Privy Council case, right, which is the case of Ambad versus Attorney General. And it's actually a case from Trinidad and Tobago, right, which went all the way to the Privy Council in 1936. That's almost 100 years ago, And there, Lord Atkins, one of the law lords of the Privy Council, he said that justice must not be a cloistered virtue. It must be allowed the respectful, though outspoken scrutiny of ordinary men. And we must be able to hear and listen to what persons have to say. So in other words, what he's trying to tell us is that, look, even though you may be on solid legal ground, you ought to still take into account the thoughts, the views of ordinary citizens, and don't feel that, well, you are so high and mighty that because, well, you are on solid legal ground that you just basically say, to hell with everybody else, I am going ahead with whatever I choose to do. Because the fact of the matter is that law is made for society. Law is made for citizens. Law is made for the people who are affected by it. So therefore, you can't divorce the legal effect of your decision from the practical effect of it on citizens. And if it is that persons are raising concerns, as to the political pedigree and lineage and, the political ancestry of your nominee for president, then that's something you ought to take into consideration. I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that it would necessarily always sway your decision, but you can't take the approach of just ignoring it and brushing it aside and, basically trying to castigate, and, demean those who are raising these questions, because in some cases people have valid concerns. And that's what I think being a leader is about. It's not just that you go on bullheaded to say, well, look, I'm going to do this regardless. I couldn't care a damn about what others think. You ought to take on board and hear what people have to say. Maybe you might have a good answer and a good explanation and be able to, show that, look, notwithstanding this, we are able to show a differentiation or that kind of thing. But at least you engage with the public in that way rather than, just berating and shouting them down, and then, trying to demonize those who are raising these concerns.
So having established that there is a legal perspective which must be considered and a moral perspective which must be considered, what are some of your thoughts on the government's consideration of the moral perspective? There are persons who are of the view that Christine Kangaloo is well suited given her career in public service. There are those who are of the view that she is too close for comfort to the administration of the day and there is need for a more independent candidate. Do you have any thoughts on the independence or perceived lack of independence of Ms. Kangaloo as the government's candidate?
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's exactly the nub of the issue, and that's where I'm saying that the government ought to, at least give some consideration to the concerns that are being raised, and consider it also, not just from the legal perspective, but also from the moral and ethical aspect of it. But, as our former Prime Minister, the witty leader Basdio Pandey has said, politics has a morality of its own. So, it would appear that, that might be what is at play here in the sense that, if one looks back historically, there were occasions when some members of the PNM would have expressed concerns. I think two persons in particular who stand out would have been I think former member of parliament, I think he now deceased Ken Valley, as one person, and I think more recently Marlene McDonald, who would have expressed views which appear to be consistent with what the opposition is saying now, and they did so as sitting members of the PNM, where they expressed concerns about somebody who is nominated as the candidate for the president having political baggage, so to speak. And their views were quite different to the views being expressed by the government now, where they seem to be brushing aside this concern as, not relevant. So, it doesn't appear to be consistent in terms of the position, and, it is something that I think ought to be more fully ventilated by the government, and maybe a more wholesome explanation needs to be put forth to show that, well, look, there are some safeguards, there are some checks and balances, and they ought to explain a little bit more to the public, maybe to show that, look, hey, there's a legal team there at President's House who would be the ones responsible for issuing legal advice. So therefore, it's not a case of Ms. Kangaloo trying to advise herself, and this legal team is independent. They would render impartial. Then at least the public will feel a little more assured in relation to the concerns that have been raised. But I'm not sure I've heard enough of that explanation. And in fact, one gets the distinct impression that some members of the government feel that, look, they don't even need to explain. If you understand me, they feel that, well, once they're on solid legal ground, then, hell with everybody else. They're going ahead with what they want to do.
One of your counterparts in the legal profession, Israel Khan, Senior Counsel, has been nominated for the post of president. His nomination came from the opposition UNC. Do you have any thoughts on the possibility of an Israel Khan presidency?
Well, it doesn't arise respectfully, so it does not even merit discussion because the way the Electoral College is structured, the government has a built-in majority. And, I think from the posturing and the words we hear from the leader of the government, which is the Prime Minister, I think it's fairly clear that they are intent on appointing Ms. Christine Kangaloo, and I think the Prime Minister also had some words for Mr. Israel Khan, which appeared, a bit, to show that, clearly the government would not be favoring him as their candidate or their choice. So I'm not sure that it really is a meritorious discussion to consider, whether he is suitable or not.
Some persons are of the view, Mr. George, that the selection of presidency is an example of why there ought to be constitutional reform. There are those who believe that the president should be voted by every person citizen in the country. There are those who believe that the Electoral College should the president should get 2/3 of the majority of the Electoral College rather than a simple one. There are some people who believe that there should not be any election at all, but that the government and the opposition should sit and have a consensus candidate. What are some of your thoughts about the need for reform of the process in selecting a president?
Well, there are some who believe in Easter Bunny and Santa Claus also, so the fact of the matter is the ordinary citizen expressing these hopes, these wishes, these desires really means nothing unless our politicians are willing to come together and be mature and sensible and respectful enough to the population to say, hey, listen, we recognize that there is need for comprehensive constitutional reform, and we are going to cooperate as government and opposition and collaborate and get it done. Because what happens is our politicians, they keep playing these mind games with us, and we as the population need to recognize the reality of what happens. When one side is in government, they have no interest in pushing ahead for constitutional reform. But then when that same side ends up in opposition, they keep clamoring, yes, we need constitutional reform. And it's just a game they keep playing with us, and keep toying with us in terms of this idea. And neither side is really serious about it when they are in government, because the fact of the matter is that it may change things so fundamentally that they may not remain in government. So therefore, none of them want to run that risk. So therefore, they always pay lip service, but they never really have any genuine intention once they are in the seat of power. In other words, they don't want to change or disturb anything which could possibly end up with them now losing that power. And that's all it is about. That's all that has been happening in Trinidad and Tobago over the last 30 or so years, because the last constitution we had was the 1976 Sir Ellis Clark Constitution, and it clearly is in need of a comprehensive overhaul. But you can only get that done if you have the cooperation of both sides of the House of Parliament, government and opposition. And when I say that, it doesn't matter which side is in government or which side is in opposition. They both need to come together at some point to get this done. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. So for us as citizens to sit down and pontificate and to, expatiate and to give our views and thoughts, it really doesn't matter, with the greatest of respect. And I'm not saying that to, make people feel disheartened or discouraged. But what I'm saying it for is so that we can understand that our focus needs to be on holding our leaders, holding our politicians to account. Regardless of which side of the aisle they sit on, we must hold them to certain standards of behavior in terms of decency, morality, and, transparency and accountability.
Mr. George, we know that you are also rooted in Tobago, and that the persons in Tobago, the citizens in Tobago, would have their own views of the presidency. What are some of the pieces of feedback, if any, that you have been hearing from the people of Tobago as they would have heard the news of this nomination of president? Is it consequential at all? Do the people of Tobago feel affected? Are they indifferent? Or do they believe that there ought to have been a Tobagonian president?
Well, no, I haven't heard that last one at all. And I mean, we've already had former President Robinson, who was from Tobago. So I haven't heard anybody suggesting that there should be a Tobagonian president. There was just the suggestion from, I think, Reginald Dumas, former head of the public service, who is a Tobagonian, who suggested that there should be a Hindu president. But you saw the head of the Mahasabha come out and debunk that theory, because he said, no, religion has nothing to do with the office of president and carrying out the duties of president. So you don't choose a president because a president is Hindu, Catholic, Presbyterian, whatever. That cannot be your basis for choosing a president. In Tobago, I think what I have heard more is people speaking on the broader issue of constitutional reform, in terms of the whole process for electing a president, choosing a president, and of course all the other aspects of the Constitution which need to be changed. So I think they've been taking a much broader view of it, as opposed to a narrow, myopic view to say, well, we want a Tobago president or a president from Tobago. I've not heard that call at all.
And even as we end our time with you, Mr. George, there's one matter that, of course, we'd like for you to clarify for us. Is it true that you were offered the presidency but declined?
Kieran, obviously you're being jocular.
Well, who knows? Maybe there could be in the future the possibility of Mr. Martin George as president. But if not in the president's house, we certainly do have him on the people's platform. And Mr. George made a number of points. Yes, Mr. George raised a number of points this morning. He said that there is both a legal aspect and a moral and ethical aspect to the selection of a president. Mr. George also quoted Section 24, which mentions or gives provision for a sitting member of the House of Representatives or a sitting MP to be elected as president, and he argued that the framers of the Constitution envisioned a sitting politician, and based on that, the government is indeed on solid legal grounds. However, Mr. George went back to the year 1936 to the Privy Council case of Ambad versus the Attorney General, and he quoted Lord Atkins, who said that justice must not be a cloistered virtue, but allow the respectful scrutiny of ordinary men and what they have to say on issues. And on that basis, Mr. George argued that the government must consider the views of ordinary men. He said that if citizens are concerned about the political pedigree or lineage of their presidential nominee, those concerns must be considered and not ignored, and that the government ought to have fully ventilated the conversation regarding safeguards, checks and balances, so that the public could be assured of impartiality by its nominee. He is lamented that some members of the government seem to not have the need to explain their choice of nominee to the country. And with respect to the possibility of an Israel Khan presidency, Mr. George said that that simply does not arise due to the structure of the Electoral College. He did speak about the need for constitutional reform and said that politicians must be willing to be mature and cooperative to recognize the need for comprehensive constitutional reform, and he lamented that lip service is paid to the issue of reform, with government and opposition liking the status quo based on the side of the fence they are on at the point in time. And on the issue of Tobago, he has said that Tobagonians seem generally interested in the broader issue of constitutional reform itself. Mr. George, for your time and your thoughts this morning, we thank you.